Hello and welcome everyone, particularly those new to Achates. Achates is a strategy, fundraising, organisational change and recruitment company dedicated to the cultural sector. This session is pre-recorded and is first broadcast at 1 p.m. on Tuesday, the 18th of June. Anything that we're mentioning is relevant at the time of recording. If you're watching the broadcast live, please note that Achates colleagues are on hand to answer any questions via the comments section. Over the last 10 years, Achates has provided provocation and inspiration to organisations and senior leaders across the cultural sector, providing expert, market disruptor and inclusive thinking across strategy, recruitment, fundraising and organisational change. With the general election announced for the 4th of July, today we look at the role we are called to play in advocating for the arts, heritage and cultural organisations and our society and sector, and if there is more we can do to help talk about our impact than simply the economic benefit that we are having, the economic benefit that we are leveraging, or indeed the funding that we are missing out on. To help us think about the advocacy role we can play, or even should play, I've invited Oonagh Murphy, Director of the Cultural Philanthropy Foundation, fresh off their launch of the Culture Makes campaign, for a discussion. Hello, Oonagh.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Oonagh is Director of the Cultural Philanthropy Foundation and also has a decade of experience as a stage director with companies such as Donmar Warehouse, Soho Theatre, Battersea Arts Centre and Lyric Belfast. Alongside her theatre work, she has been involved in campaigning for social change in Ireland around reproductive rights, marriage equality and asylum seeker rights, and she was awarded the Joe Cox Award for Young Female Campaigner in recognition of this work. On the 4th of July, the country will hold a general election and the power of our government will be locked in for another period of at least 4 years. As individual arts, heritage and cultural organisations, we've often held strong political opinions and strong convictions about the desires we have for change. But how often have we used our collective voices to lobby for culture and to make sure that cultural landscapes can be institutional to the landscape of our country? Major charities such as Shelter or Christian Aid have huge policy and advocacy departments and are committed to seeing structural change to our laws and ensuring pressure remains on those in positions of power to make the best decisions. Is it time for us to consider how we can create our own advocacy channels and ensure that we are helping create the policies and structural changes that ensure the future of our arts and heritage landscape in the UK? In the run-up to the general election, there's an increasing narrative to save the arts. But what does that actually mean? Equity last week launched a campaign to ensure that all candidates would go on record to committing to oppose cuts to existing funding and pledge to ring-fence arts and entertainment funding. At the same time, Dame Judi Dench came out with a similar plea to save the arts, but again from a different angle. Alongside this, the Cultural Philanthropy Foundation recently launched a nationwide campaign, Culture Makes, with over 200 organisations committed to adding their collective voice to sharing the impact of culture outside of purely an economic argument. The 8 types of impact were devised by our director, Caroline McCormick, in 2020 through the analysis of 120 case studies as to how cultural organisations were supporting their communities in the pandemic. Since their creation, we have employed the 8 types of impact with more than 100 cultural and heritage organisations and have found them a vital tool in helping to address, in a simple and coherent way, the long-standing problem of the value and impacts of culture and heritage. The 8 types of impact of culture and heritage are intrinsic or creative benefit, economic, mental health and well-being, physical health, educational, social benefit, community building, and innovation. So, in summary, they're a lot broader than simply economic. At Achates, we also are beginning work on a 9th type of impact, environmental, focused on impactful benefit, not simply mitigating a negative environmental impact. With the general election in mind, we've asked Oonagh of the Cultural Philanthropy Foundation to come and offer us some guidance on the advocacy we should all be committed to as arts organisations and how we can help ensure and secure a bright and vibrant future for culture in the UK. Oonagh.
Hi, Fiona. Thanks so much.
And so, Oonagh, I'd like to start just by asking you what role you think organisations and individuals should have in advocating for culture.
Yeah, I think firstly, just to say this is a really exciting moment and to just acknowledge that. I think we're all very aware that this is the first time in a long time that it feels like there's a real possibility of a seismic shift in Westminster. So it's great to just sort of feel and acknowledge that potential. But moreover, and I suppose to sort of darken the mood, I think, we should also be aware of the sort of changing political landscape globally, but in particular across Europe and the recent elections, recent European elections, sort of the shift to the right that we saw there. So that's the kind of long range forecast that we need to consider. And I think that informs how I'm thinking about what happens between now and the 4th of July. But I think more importantly, after the 4th of July, because that's when the real change and the real work is going to start. We need to ensure, as a sector, that what we're doing now and in the next, within the next year, for example, is about creating systemic change. So it isn't short-lived. It's embedded. It can't be changed by, a government in however many years' time. And I suppose that it's resistant to those more divisive forces that we're seeing elsewhere. So that's just to say that there is so much at stake. And the good news is that I really think as a sector, there's so much that we can do to play a role in that change. As we know, Equity released a report recently where they found that, as well as the 500 million decline in investment from local authorities in recent years, Arts Council funding has been cut by 16% across the UK since 2017. That figure is staggering, but it's also not a surprise. Funding in England dropped by 11%, in Wales by 30%, and in Northern Ireland by 16%. It increased in Scotland by 2%. And you can see quite particularly the constituencies that have lost out more than others. And those results are also not a surprise, and they could make you quite angry. Rishi Sunak's constituency has only seen a 10% cut since 2014. So that's quite different to, Wales' 30% cut. So whatever happens on polling day, this is just the beginning of a conversation. And I suppose we have a foot in the door, a door that feels like it has been closed for over a decade. So what we're really trying to do with the foundation is to form a coalition of, bringing people together and saying, look, so far, we haven't been able to find a unified way of talking about the way in which culture and the arts creates impact across lots of different types of areas. And what's going to be imperative is to move away, as you say, from that kind of market-based logic, the kind of economic value, which we all did so well during the pandemic. But then when we weren't selling tickets, of course, what's the value of a cultural sector that it isn't bringing in economic value? So that just shows the precarity, I suppose, of focusing on one type of impact. And we're trying, I suppose, in our Culture Makes campaign to really lead a shift in how we talk about culture as central to a life well lived. We have over 220 organizations now with us showcasing 8 types of impact. So alongside intrinsic and economic, which we're all slightly better versed at talking about, we're also asking organizations to showcase their impact in mental health, in community building, in education, social benefit, physical health, and innovation. And really across what is now the next 6 months, so the first 5 months of a new government, whoever that may be, we're saying organizations are already doing this work. Look at what we're managing to achieve with those staggering cuts to funding. Imagine what might be possible if we were properly funded and if there was proper investment in the sector. So I think that's the work that we're really, really trying to hone in on. It's not just about getting a different, a different political party in July. It's actually about saying there needs to be a huge culture shift, and we have the tools to do that.
Thank you. That's so helpful. I'm interested in particular, and I think this speaks to your experience in particular, but how it might be a different experience for freelancers or individual artists in advocating in that space as opposed to organizations. Just
Yeah,
wondering
definitely.
if you have thoughts on, I guess, where the power of collective is so important, perhaps.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think just to speak, just firstly, for cultural organizations, I think we should also acknowledge that the Arts Council, the Charity Commission, has been really quite stringent about people's ability to politically campaign. And it has created a sort of a muzzling effect, a kind of anxiety, where there is almost this sort of vacuum with people not really acknowledging that this is really happening. And I suppose I would just push back on that, to anyone connected to an organization, to say, we of course have a right to speak about our right to vote. Organizations can't hone in on particular political objectives that don't align with their with their objects, but we can educate and provoke debate around people's ability to vote. So I'd say for organizations, and then for freelance artists, I think this is going out on the 18th of June. It's the last day to register to vote, but there's a huge piece of work there about encouraging people to use their vote. There's a brilliant statistic by My Life, My Say that says I think it's like 4 million young people are missing from the electoral register. And just to think about, what that might represent in terms of sort of democratic change that could initiate, maybe that's something that we focus on for the next set of elections, including European elections. So I think, there's a role that we can all play. Any of us who have the ability to sort of communicate, who have a platform, I think there's a piece here around saying, are you going to vote? What's the point in voting? Reminding people they'll need ID, and all of the various barriers that we see around, people turning up on polling day, as happened in May, people turning up and not being able to vote. We know that affects people who experience in other forms of intersectional exclusion more. So that's what we're up against. So I'd say first and foremost, there's a piece around getting people to the polling station. But I would say for freelance artists as well, being really tuned into the nuances of the conversation around how funding works and funding as a form of power is really, it's of benefit to everybody to use that canvassing period in the lead up to the election, but also to then, focus on what areas people can lobby around. So if someone's standing on your doorstep, asking them what they're going to do for the arts, also asking them what they understand the problem to be with the arts. I've definitely had conversations with politicians over the years who'll sort of, sound like they know what they're talking about. But if you actually say, well, what would you do? Or what do you think the issue is there? I think there's a sense that there's, that they've kind of learned off a few statistics and they're kind of giving you a sort of vague answer. Any movement that I've been involved in, what has brought about huge social change is coalition of people who are unlikely allies. So I think what we could be seeding now is an understanding of the places that finding out what those commonalities might be between unlikely allies, and using this as a moment to kind of organize, to campaign around those commonalities. We really need to collaborate with each other so much more. And I think, that dynamic between freelance artists or, arts workers, like producers, even academics who aren't necessarily connected to organizations. I think this is a moment for us to say the dynamic might have been different in the past, but actually what's at stake now is there's a far higher level of what's at stake. So really sort of finding ways that people can come together in a grassroots way. That's the kind of civic engagement piece I think that I get really excited about. And we might have become quite myopic about what's the point. I think that's the feeling with the current government. What's the point? But there is a potential here to really shift how culture is embedded in policy going forward. And I think that's what we as a sector can really look forward to.
Thank you. There's so many interesting things that you just said there, and a couple that I'd just like to pick up on. Firstly, you talked about that really interesting problem, I guess paralysis, one might even say, that's been caused by Orlando Fraser, the Charity Commission, and indeed the Arts Council's comments that have changed some of the guidance and therefore perhaps made people feel murkier about whether they're allowed to talk about these issues. If you are watching this and you're particularly interested in this or want more background, just to say that our last month Achates Inspires, we talked a lot about that balance, particularly in ethics and an income environment, but with that Orlando Fraser change of phrase at the Charity Commission, with great insights from Deborah Myers, the Director of Fundraising and Partnerships at Science Museum Group, and Tom Bird, Chief Executive of Sheffield Theatre. So you can find that on our YouTube if you do want to catch up on that conversation. But I think that the point that you made that really fascinates me is funding as a form of power. And you quite rightly spoke about that politician on the doorstep who has a really strong communication skill, perhaps in quoting 2 or 3 lines they've been taught to say. May I even say taught to say? That's maybe inappropriate, but often the arts won't necessarily be their passion, knowledge, expertise. And there is a reminder, I think, and a challenge to us that we are the experts. There's no one else who's going to come up and save the arts on our behalf. Actually, the challenge is on us. And as you rightly said, that coalition of people who are unlikely allies feels the important thing. And so I guess to think positively, I'm interested in what power you think that we might have if we did form that coalition of unlikely allies at government level.
Yeah, I think it's such a good point. I mean, I think it's just a matter of fact that not just the politician standing on your doorstep, but potentially the person who's made, culture minister, they're not a subject matter expert, as you say, we are. And I don't think we often treat ourselves as that. I don't think we approach, thinking about our sector in a way that has kind of vision and bravery. And that's usually for lots of reasons. People are overworked and underfunded, and thinking bravely is a luxury that people cannot afford. But I think there's, what's going to happen is a new government will be increasingly turning to the sector as stakeholders in consultation, and that's going to happen very soon. So we need to have, it's not necessarily about a unified approach. Obviously, a diversity of opinion is hugely important. But I think for me, one of the biggest pitfalls we make is that we too often see ourselves as the beneficiaries, or frame ourselves as the beneficiaries of funding. And of course, I'm saying this with an understanding that, speaking as somebody who has been a freelance artist myself, artists need to be paid fairly, art workers need to be able to make a living, freelance career pathways need to be developed. All of that is, of course, hugely important. But I think there is often what's missing from conversations about funding as a form of power is that we're not speaking about the importance of culture as a sort of a multiplier effect across society. So we sort of get siloed into conversations where we only speak about the impact to ourselves, to our career, to our programming, rather than speaking about culture as something that has, as we would say, 8 types of impact. So a systemic shift is going to require that we get much better about communicating that impact, because as we know, that overemphasis on any particular type of impact creates a precarity and means that we sort of find ourselves in cul-de-sacs where we can't actually sort of maneuver into different parts of the conversation. And I think, with the kind of cuts to local authorities, and hopefully that being something that gets addressed, and a sort of maybe slightly different conversation about what levelling up has been developed to do, what does regeneration look like? I think we're going to have to move very fast to say culture is in here as equally important as, ensuring that there's good social care, ensuring that the high street is regenerated. All of these things, I think, are going to be part of a sort of a joined up way of thinking. And yeah, as you say, we have to be the ones to advocate for that, because nobody else is going to on our behalf.
Thank you. And you said very succinctly earlier, but culture is central to a life well lived. And I think it's really important, isn't it, to reframe that as an additional nice view of going to visit the theatre, say, which we might perhaps feel embarrassed about advocating for, to actually thinking more about that enrichment of life and what is a life well lived. And that's probably a really nice moment for me to ask if you could just, we've both referenced it slightly, but could you just explain to me in a bit more detail what the campaign is exactly?
Yes, exactly. So Culture Makes is a campaign. It's being led by the Cultural Philanthropy Foundation, and it's using the 8 types of impact, which were developed by Achates. And the campaign is now a coalition of 220 organizations, and still counting, still open for you to join us. Those organizations are across music, dance, theatre, film, visual art, libraries, museums, and more. And what we're doing is we're collectively raising our voices to showcase those 8 types of impact. It's structured as a series of collective actions. So between now and the end of the year, once a month, we highlight a different type of impact. We've already celebrated creative impact. In June, we're celebrating economic impact. And then in, nice timing for a new government, we'll be talking about all of the different types of all of the different types of impact, including education, innovation, mental health, physical health, community building, and social benefits. So it'll be one a month then all the way up to December. As I said, we've invited organizations to join us. And what's been really important is having a sort of a broad representative coalition of both smaller organizations who maybe just have 1 or 2 part-time, full-time members of staff, right up to bigger, kind of what you might consider the major institutions or the top brands. So, the idea is that the campaign offers people a sort of a toolbox, I suppose, to really hone in on some of the quite incredible kind of outputs and outcomes of their work. We're asking people to use sort of visual storytelling, which we obviously have in abundance as a sector. We have eye-catching content, that would engage anybody across any of the kind of social media platforms. But then alongside that, we have kind of first-person narratives, so people speaking in testimony to the work of a particular organization or a particular part of their programming. And then we're asking people to share, the stats. So each of the impacts, I suppose, has particular figures that we're asking people to look at for their work. So the upcoming one around economic value, we're asking people to share the figures of, numbers of staff, numbers of artists engaged, paid opportunities, commissions, donations from audiences, and then their gross value added as well. So really, what is the economic impact of this organization existing, even as they often do in kind of dire straits? And then what we're also asking those who are not connected to an organization, importantly, we want people to be able to speak about their work, right across the range. So artists, producers, academics, any sort of arts heritage workers, campaigners around culture, those who would be considered sort of to work on a freelance basis. We're asking them to come on board as campaign ambassadors as well. So, we have a range of individuals who are developing, stories of impact, I suppose, about how one particular type of impact has benefited them, or, that they see a particular type of impact in their work. And so the idea is that there is this kind of confluence of organizations and freelance. It's not a hierarchy. It's actually about saying both the kind of the big players are on the same level as kind of those who maybe historically haven't had as much status or power or voice, I suppose, visibility. And really it's about sort of starting to level out that playing field. One final thing I'll say on the campaign in particular is we have looked at the idea of environmental impact being the 9th impact. And what has emerged so far is that organizations have lots of amazing plans and there are things in motion. You know, organizations sort of point to particular projects. What has been evidenced at the moment is there is offsetting of negative impact rather than producing positive impact, which is a sort of a nuanced thing, I suppose, to kind of hone and understand. But really what we want to be able to work towards is that as a sector, we can say we're producing positive environmental impact. So that's sort of on the cards as a strand of thought leadership and of work over the coming year, that we sort of will convene a conversation around that with all of the Culture Makes partners as well.
Thank you. It's so interesting. It's particularly interesting thinking about that growth of environmental, but from a positive standpoint, as you mentioned. I guess I'm particularly interested always in the space that the social investment and social impact spheres have in taking up space, advocating for B Corps and equivalent positive change organisations, social impact organisations. I feel like they have done so well, particularly in this last government cycle, at communicating the worth of creating businesses in that way. And that in turn has created incredible relationships, often in the delivery of government contracts and funding relationships in different ways through delivering healthcare or education contracts. And I feel often when we as arts organisations talk, or heritage or culture, we're often stuck in this funding cycle that requires investment purely in a non-repayable way. And I think that that innately has problems because we only see our value as a beneficiary, as you rightly said earlier, rather than thinking about that holistic view that we in turn can actually be change makers. And earlier you said thinking bravely is a luxury that people can't necessarily afford. And I think that's a really good challenge to us, because often we would think as artists and culture makers that we are being brave, but really there is a need often, we think, to protect our organizations and our individual patterns. And I think one of the things that I felt most challenged by in our conversation is the advocacy that really we need to have as a sector isn't necessarily to vote a certain way, it's to vote, and it's to advocate that the sector has far greater impact than the sum of its parts. And that's the most important advocacy piece, although I'm sure both you and I hold very nuanced and strong political opinions. In some ways, it's irrelevant. The thing that's important is that our voices are heard, not necessarily that we're making sure that people pick particular sides. I don't know how you feel about that.
I mean, I completely agree. I think, you know, what we're seeing in the sort of scarier aspects of political change is actually that there's been a huge sense of alienation and of you know, for a long time, individuals feeling like mainstream politics doesn't speak to them. And I think that's, you know, that has the potential, some would argue, has already taken hold in the UK. And I think what I see as a sort of parallel in the work that we do is our work only works when we have an audience. It's a conversation, you know, good theatre. When I work as a director, I often think of myself as the first audience member. Good theatre is built on a sort of an ongoing understanding and dialogue with an audience. And that's, you know, that's not about it being participatory. It is just quite literally, it doesn't work if we're not thinking about our audience. And I think that's the thing that people can connect into around this conversation. You know, our work has an inherent democracy to it when it's done well. And so we have the potential, and this sounds really esoteric, but we have the potential to sort of be a really good example of a sort of a democratic system at a time when those systems are sort of failing left, right, and center, quite literally left, right, and center. And so I think that's something for us to really kind of to hold on to. As I said earlier, there is the danger of feeling really kind of myopic and sort of battle weary at this point. Um, but I suppose there's there's a kind of a rallying cry there, I would say, which is to say, go back to what is the one issue that you feel really strongly about. And not to sound like Pollyanna, but maybe think, how might that issue be? How might there be somebody else on the political spectrum, or someone who I might perceive as being quite in a different place in the political spectrum, who I might connect to on this issue? A really good example would be like housing. Often, and this is a huge conversation in Ireland at the moment, you've got working class communities getting driven out of places. And at the same time, you've got migrant communities who are arriving in and they're living in tents. And actually, those two demographics, the political system would have them diametrically opposed, but they have far more in common than the people who are making the decisions about, who gets to live where. That's just one example, but I suspect that there's far more examples of that in our work and in the way that we bring people together to sit, not just to sit, but to be in spaces together in a way that they wouldn't necessarily be in any other part of society. Potentially the only other place where it happens is the education system, maybe, and the healthcare system. So it's quite profound that those are the things that have been under threat. And that's really what we're talking about. Yeah, we're talking about cultural funding, but we're talking about civil society. So without sort of overblowing it, I think that's what I hang on to, and I sort of feel like, oh God, it's all too much. But actually, it's really not. Like, we have the tools, we do it in our work all the time. It's just about going back to it and looking at it, looking at the ways that we're programming work, or looking at who's in the room and who's not. All of those conversations, I think, can be really powerful. And once we get over the general election, maybe there'll be a bit more space to actually breathe and think in that quite co-creative, I suppose would be the word, to think about that in a more productive way.
It's really interesting, in particular, you just highlighted healthcare and education there. And I think it is really interesting thinking about those more discretionary spending funds that often will vary wildly, budget to budget, and government to government, indeed, and how strong and empowered the communities are in those two sectors to advocate for themselves. I do think one of the things that perhaps we've lost is that I think often as a cultural sector, we can also be fearful of coming across as competitive against things like the NHS, say, or the education system. But really, as you rightly said, it's intrinsic that there is a kind of social value and inherency to all of those. And, if I was being controversial, I would say that perhaps the spending cuts should instead sit with maybe defence. But that's my controversial political opinions coming out for a moment. But rather than us being fearful, as I think perhaps often maybe fundraisers will find it particularly difficult thinking, if they're challenged, well, why does this matter more than supporting insert the name of a children's hospital here? And I think that's where we've often found this tension, is that intersection between healthcare and education in particular, when we're put in that pool. But there's something I think really important that you just said about the specific power of culture. You said our work has an inherent democracy to it when it works well. And while I do think that there's spaces that create narrative and dialogue in healthcare and education, that ability to all be seen as the same, to allow everyone a seat at the table or a democratic voice, that totally has been lost, many feel, in a political landscape. Perhaps that is where culture can really provide some desperate solutions to our society that it feels like it critically needs at the minute.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely that. And I think, again, not to sort of venture into how I think the public purse should be broken down, but yeah, I agree. I think we've swallowed what is essentially an ideological position. we don't have to name it, but we've swallowed an ideological position that there is a limited amount of funding that can go towards improving the lives of the citizens of a country. And that's a lie. Because as you see, as you've said, when the money needs to be found for things that are certainly not improving the lives of either our country or others, the money is there. So I think first and foremost, it's about, undoing that lie in our heads and the internal, the internal logic that there is a kind of a scarcity there. But that it's a huge shift, I think. And I think on the, as you say, the kind of fundraising piece, yeah, there's this sort of perceived idea that that there's only a certain type of work that will get funded, or that you have to be very careful and play it safe. But I would say, and I think you'd probably be able to come up with many, many examples. For the most part, people who give to culture are hugely excited by everything that we're speaking about, the sort of egalitarian role, the egalitarian kind of environment that can be created by the work of artists, and that isn't something to be afraid of or something to sort of shy away from. And I think that's essentially what's at the core of the campaign, is about saying, hey, we don't need to keep catering our cell to different audiences. Maybe it's actually more powerful for us to collectively say, this work is, unified by the impact that it has across, social benefit, for example, and the fact that the cultural sector has essentially had to step in where, social care has failed often because of the funding cuts there, and that a lot of cultural organizations are doing what social care charities haven't been able to do. All of that, I think we've been sort of a little bit polite about shouting about that, but actually maybe now is the time to say that's, we've kind of internalized something that doesn't really need to exist anymore, and we can speak in a different way and use a different language.
Thank you, Oonagh. I so appreciate it. And I just want to come back to at the very start, you mentioned that equity report that's just been published. And I guess in terms of people feeling empowered to vote or to also be the experts to their local politicians, I just want to remind everyone, because we haven't had a change of government in 14 years, that this is an opportunity, I guess, to remind you of the power of your voting voice. The four kind of headline stats in equity. So UK-wide Arts Council funding has been cut by 16% in real terms since 2017. Arts Council England funding has been cut by 11% in real terms since 2017. As Oonagh rightly pointed out, specifically looking to Wales, Arts Council Wales funding has been cut by 30% in real terms since 2017. So just to remind you, I guess, the power of your collective voice to be experts, and to also challenge your local politicians to ensure that manifestos are as rich as they need to be, rather than us being polite about what we need. Thank you, Oonagh, so much for your time. I'm so grateful for our rich debate. Definitely feeling quite inspired after that.
Good. Thank you so much, Fiona.
So thank you everyone for watching today's Achates Inspires. We'll have an Achates colleague online for the next 10 minutes to answer any questions that you might have in the comments section. You'll also find a link down in the description box today if you'd like to find out more about the campaign that Oonagh has been talking about. And indeed, we'd love to challenge you to sign up if you haven't done already. Achates, as you might know, is here to support the sector. And we do this in a variety of ways, ranging from strategic business planning to feasibility studies, recruitment support from development positions to CEOs, and organizational change to help transform your boards and teams through new hires and development of pre-existing teams. We also offer a range of fundraising and income generation support, including strategy development and bid writing. And as the sector continues to navigate these interesting financial times and the increasing competition for funding, we work with companies to help them consider their unique organizational assets and the routes to leverage those to develop adjacent and income streams, which add value whilst furthering purpose. Please don't hesitate to get in touch if there's something that you would like support with. Our next Achates Inspires session will be in July. We look forward to welcoming you there.